Okay, good afternoon. I will adjust the lights here. Let's see if I can adjust the lights. Tell me what's good and what's not good. Is that okay? See the screen? Turn some more on or off?
Oh,
What is it about?
How about that?
no.
What is the subject?
You
It's
gotta get
okay?
those front lights off.
Richard Nixon. It's
Uh,
still too light, I think. Still much,
okay.
it's too much light.
Let's see, is this turn down the light?
Yeah, there's a set of switches back there, and then the others would be out.
Hey.
Okay.
You got it.
How's that? Okay.
That's okay.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good
My name is Evan Weiner, and I have dealt with this guy starting in 1985. Hello, hello. Starting in 1985, I dealt with him. Let me see if I can get this on. If not, can you hear me without this?
I can hear you.
Okay. Anyway, Richard Nixon was the President of the United States. We go back 50 years, and I will tell you how I met Richard Nixon. It was in 1985. Nixon was the arbitrator of the Major League Baseball owners and Major League Baseball umpires dispute. And I got to know him through a guy by the name of Richie Phillips, who was the head of the Umpires Association. And the owners and the players were, rather the owners and the umpires were at an impasse. And they didn't know what to do. So Richie Phillips, who lived in Society Hill off the main line in Philadelphia, calls the baseball commissioner, Peter Ueberroth. He says, what do you think about arbitration? He says, well, who do you got in mind? He says, Dick Nixon. He says, Dick Nixon, get out of here. How do you know him? He's next door babysitting Julia David Eisenhower's grandkids. Can you imagine Dick Nixon as a grandfather? Let me make this perfectly clear. I want that mess cleaned up now, or else. Can you imagine Nixon as a grandfather? But that's how I got to meet him initially. He's the arbitrator, and we go down to his office, which was across the street from the Southern District Courthouse in Lower Manhattan at Foley Square. And I go up there with a guy by the name of Gene Orza, another guy by the name of Arthur Shack. Bruce Morton might have been with us. And we said to the secretary, we're here to talk to Mr. Nixon, President Nixon. Well, he's not here. Okay, where do you want us to wait? Well, you could go in his office and wait. And I walked into his office with the others, and it was a miniature Oval Office. He had the Resolute desk, or a copy of it, and he had everything else, and he had pictures going from here to there, and he had flags of the world and all that. And unfortunately, back in those days, we did not have one of these, which is a cell phone, because every one of us went behind his desk, and we all did the same thing. I am not a crook. I am not a crook. And that's how I met Richard Nixon, and I got to know him. Well, I really didn't get to know him, but I knew he knew my first name. I would say, hello, President Nixon, or Mr. Nixon, and he'd say, Evan, no, just call me Dick. Just call me Dick. And I used to call him Dick. We knew each other for about 4 years. He had lived in Upper Saddle River, New Jersey, and every weekend he was down in Philadelphia. So that's how I knew Richard Nixon. So it's 1973, Dick Nixon, John Dean, who is still on CNN these days talking about the perils of Donald Trump in the court system, judicial system, testifying before Congress. H.R. Haldeman was Nixon's chief of staff. John Ehrlichman was one of Nixon's advisors. And Spiro Agnew, for a good chunk of 1973, was the vice president under Dick Nixon. Now, anybody here protest against the Vietnam War? You did. Where'd you protest? Oh, Cleveland. Cleveland. That's right. I remember that. Well, the war is finally coming to an end in the early days of 1973. There was the Yom Kippur War in Israel. There was a gas crisis, you might remember if you were even or odd. My friend Shelley Saltman, yeah, Shelley, we're talking about you. The late Shelley Saltman was the promoter of this, the Battle of the Sexes between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. And I got some stories about that from my friend, the late Shelley Saltman. Secretariat was the horse of the year. He won the Triple Crown. And Johnny Carson caused a toilet paper shortage in 1973. I don't know if you remember this, but there was a shortage of toilet paper in 1973. That is the Watergate Hotel. That is me when I had hair and I was a lot younger back in 1982 walking past the Watergate. And in June of 1972, the Democratic National Committee, their offices were broken into by these guys, known as the plumbers. They were the 5 guys who broke into the office. On January 8th, the Watergate break-in trial begins. The accused are Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Baker, James McCourt, Eugenio Martinez, and Frank Sturgis. Now, it's a busy January. It's a really busy January. Vietnam War is about over. The Watergate break-in trial begins and Lyndon Johnson passes away. And you might notice Lyndon Johnson's hair in that picture. He grew it out long. And why did he grow it out long? Because all those guys around Nixon had crew cuts. And he wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he did not support Richard Nixon. On January 18th, Lyndon Johnson suffered a heart attack and died. Nixon's second term begins on January 20th, 1973. There is Dick Nixon and the long-suffering Mrs. Nixon, Pat Nixon. So Spiro Agnew is sworn in for a second term as vice president. And then there's this, Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade is settled, or at least we thought it was settled, but it was settled in 1973 by the Supreme Court. It's January 22nd, case of Roe v. Wade, 410 U.S. 113, 7-2 decision. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. And the women's liberation movement won that. And the people who were in their 20s, 30s, 40s back in those days who protested got a victory. And sometimes you have to remind young people of that. In Vietnam, well, it's almost over. The peace talks broke down in December 1972. There's Henry Kissinger, who just passed away at the age of 100. December 13th, 1972, the Paris peace talks between the North Vietnamese and the Americans broke down. A different approach is coming. Merry Christmas. Here it comes. Bombing and bombing and bombing. On December 18th, 1972, 5 days after the breakdown in peace talks, Richard Nixon announced the start of Christmas bombing of North Vietnam. American B-52s and fighter bombers dropped over 20,000 tons of bombs on the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong. The United States lost 15 of its giant B-52s and 11 other aircraft during the attacks. North Vietnam claimed that 1,600 civilians were killed. The bombings would end on December 29, 1972. The North Vietnamese said, okay, we're going back to the peace table, and they did. So it's back to Paris. Here is a picture of what was going on in Vietnam at the time, and it would be over in a few days. Creep. There has been no better description of a campaign or a presidential re-election campaign than these 5 letters describing the campaign. Creep. Kind of Richard Nixon-ish, you know, because he was kind of creepy. Committee for the re-election of the president. Short, creep. Kind of describes Nixon. Vietnam, this is 1972. The Vietnam War continued. The American economy was a mess. In the 1970 midterms, the Democrats won the popular vote in the House by 8.7% and added a dozen seats. In 1971, Nixon's approval ratings dipped below 50%. Nixon had to do something to get reelected. Call me Dick. Let me tell you about this autograph of Richard Nixon. I'm with Nixon one day, and I have an index card. And I said, you know what? I've never gotten a presidential autograph Why don't I get one? So I hand the card to Nixon, and we don't have a table here. Well, maybe the piano will do. So I hand the card to Nixon. He's at a desk, and he lines the card up with the edge of the desk. And then he takes a little ruler out of his pocket, and on the ruler, he writes out his name, Richard Nixon, and you can see it's pretty straight. He finishes writing his name and crosses the X, and there it is, my autograph. And I thought, this is the strangest thing I've ever seen, somebody taking that much time to give me an autograph. I mean, it's an autograph, that's all it is. But here I am, this is 1973, and I'm 16, turning 17 years old. He is one of the main players in Watergate. So was another guy by the name of Lawrence O'Brien. And I knew Lawrence O'Brien. I was covering sports, and he was the commissioner of the National Basketball Association. So I'm thinking one day, by the time I'm 26 years old, Lawrence O'Brien, whose office was broken into at the Watergate Hotel, I've dealt with him. By 1985, I've dealt with Richard Nixon. And I'm thinking, what would that 16-year-old in 1972, when this all broke out, what would he be thinking if within 13 years he'd be dealing with the two main combatants in the Watergate break-in? Well, this guy is G. Gordon Liddy. He's a lawyer, and he decides he's going to give Richard Nixon some really good lawyer advice. It's January 1972. G. Gordon Liddy, General Counsel to CREEP, the Committee for the Re-election of the President. It's such an apt name, CREEP. Proposes burglarizing and wiretapping the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Yeah, I'm a lawyer. You should do something illegal. Break into the office. And that's what they were going to do. And there is Larry O'Brien. And he used to be with the Kennedy, or he was part of the Kennedy administration, part of the Boston Irish Mafia, along with O'Donnell and Powers and Sorensen. Well, Sorensen was Norwegian, and Pierre Salinger, he was French, but they were all the Boston Irish Mafia who served John F. Kennedy. It's May 17th, and they decide to listen to G. Gordon Liddy. Wiretaps placed on the phones of the Democratic National Committee Chairman, Lawrence O'Brien, and the Executive Director of the Democratic States Chairman, R. Spencer Oliver, Jr. On June the 17th, 1972, Frank Wills, a security guard at the Watergate complex, called police at 1:30 in the morning, and all of a sudden these 5 men are arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters office. They followed G. Gordon Liddy, his plan. On June 18th, 1972, Gonzalez, Barker, McCord, Martinez, and Sturgis are charged with attempted burglary and attempted interception of telephone and other communications. So there are two young guys who are working at the Washington Post. Two guys who are at the bottom of the totem pole at the Washington Post. This guy on the left is Bob Woodward, Robert Woodward. He's he's an educated guy, and the other guy here is Carl Bernstein, who got out of high school and became a cop reporter. Now let me tell you a little bit of being a cop reporter, because I was kind of a cop reporter a little bit. You're on the streets, and anything goes. Anything absolutely goes. When I was a cop, when I had to cover some police activity, basically I went face to face with an accused murderer, belt and brims. You went to houses that burnt down, and I couldn't deal with it anymore, so I'm never going to cover the cop beat anymore, because it's just really grisly. But Bernstein was a guy who would throw grenades. Didn't matter to him. He was going to throw grenades, while Woodward would have a sentence like, "A cow is brown." What are all these words correct? A cow. He just was meticulous in terms of what he was doing, whereas Bernstein would throw bombs. On June 19th, 1972, these obscure young reporters at the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Robert Woodward, Bob Woodward, revealed that one of the Watergate burglars was James McCourt, a Republican Party security aide. And there is James McCourt. In June and July of 72, Woodward and Bernstein got a source. The source was called Deep Throat. We now know it was Mark Felt. And he reveals, he says, look, you know what? Take a look at the burglar's account. And it shows a link going back to the 1972 Committee to Re-elect the President through its subordinate financial committee. The candidates for the 1972 or on the 1972 ballot: Richard Nixon, the Republican; George McGovern, the senator from South Dakota, the Democrat. The way Nixon figured it, and his strategists figured it, in 1972, it was going to be Edmund Muskie, the senator from Maine, and they had to get as much dirt on Muskie as possible. They were afraid of him. This is a guy who had no personality, by the way. He was absolutely devoid of personality, and yet here he is on the campaign trail. I'm not a crook. I'm not a crook. On August 29, 1972, Nixon has a news conference, and he says, I can say categorically that no one in the White House staff, no one in this administration presently employed was involved in this very bizarre incident. Oh, only a mother could love that face. There he is, Richard Nixon.
Maybe not.
Maybe not, right. It's August 30th, 1972, and there's an internal investigation by the White House, done by the White House counsel, John Dean, about the Watergate break-in. And guess what? We weren't involved. That's the end of it. Somebody else did it. We weren't involved. But these two guys continue. And the real heroes of the Watergate saga, in terms of the whole investigation journalistically, are Ben Bradley, who's the executive editor of the Washington Post, and Katharine Graham, who's the publisher of the Washington Post. Because they told these two guys, we trust you. Go ahead. Look. Keep looking. Keep looking. Keep looking. Keep looking. Maybe you'll find something. And they kept at it. They kept digging and digging and digging. Today, the Washington Post is cutting a lot of employees. So the newspaper industry, unfortunately, is dying, and I was once an ink-stained wretch. September 29, 1972, the Washington Post reports that Nixon's former Attorney General, John Mitchell, once controlled a secret fund to finance intelligence gathering against Democrats. When Carl Bernstein calls Mitchell for a comment, Mitchell threatens both Bernstein and Katharine Graham, the publisher of the paper. Well, you know what? We'll show you. Here's the threat, word for word, in the paper. Now, this is the guy they went after. This is the guy that they were afraid of, Edmund Muskie. Muskie was Hubert Humphrey's running mate in 1968 when Nixon beat Humphrey. Humphrey didn't break from Lyndon Johnson on Vietnam, and that's probably what helped him lose. In October 1972, Woodward and Bernstein report that the FBI had made connections between Nixon's aides and the Watergate break-in. Woodward and Bernstein described the existence of a major dirty tricks campaign conducted against Muskie, orchestrated by Donald Segretti and others, paid by Creep and Nixon's private attorney. On November 7, 1972, Nixon is elected to a second term in office. He defeated George McGovern, and this was a blowout. Nixon won 49 of 50 states, got 520 electoral votes, 61% of the popular vote, and beat McGovern by about 18 million votes. But there were storm clouds brewing, and the White House knew that there would be trouble ahead in 1973. Well, here are two of the plumbers, McCourt, one of them, in Washington. On January 8th, the Watergate burglary trial begins. Five defendants would plead guilty. Liddy and McCourt are convicted after the trial. Well, corruption. There's a lot of corruption around Richard Nixon. This guy, L. Patrick Gray, is supposed to be the guy who's taking over as the head of the FBI as J. Edgar Hoover is out. He's got to go through a congressional process. On February 28th, the acting director of the FBI, L. Patrick Gray, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee during his nomination to replace J. Edgar Hoover as the director of the FBI. Armed with newspaper articles indicating the White House had possession of FBI Watergate files, the committee chairman, the Democrat Sam Ervin of North Carolina, questioned Gray as to what he knew about the White House obtaining the files. And there is Ervin. Gray said, yeah, you know, it is true. I gave FBI reports to John Dean. Yeah, he's the White House counsel. He's a good guy and all that. And yeah, I discussed the investigation with Dean. It also came out that L. Patrick Gray destroyed important evidence entrusted to him by Dean. Gray's nomination, guess what? He failed. And all of a sudden, John Dean is directly linked to the Watergate cover-up. And there's James McCourt, and he's not happy about being sentenced in the Watergate break-in. On March 19th, in a letter to Judge John J. Sirica, a Republican, just like Nixon, James McCourt says the defendants had been pressured to plead guilty and remain silent. The perjury was committed and the others were involved. McCourt said that his plea and testimony were compelled by pressure from the former White House counsel John Dean and the former Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell. And there is Gordon Liddy. So it's March 23rd, 5 Watergate burglars along with Liddy and E. Howard Hunt were sentenced with stiff fines, maximum prison time of up to 40 years in jail. G. Gordon Liddy did not get 40 years. In fact, he got a career out of this in my business, radio and TV. So it is March, and Richard Nixon wants to know a little more about what happened back in June of 1972. So he tells John Dean, he says, hey John, let's go up to Camp David. You know, the place, the presidential retreat, named after my son-in-law. You know my son-in-law, David Eisenhower. He married Julie and all that. Let's go up there. We'll have a bonding, men-only bonding session. You know, we can sit around, maybe watch some college basketball. You know, we can sit around in our undershirts, maybe scratch each other. Not you, I won't scratch you, but we can scratch ourselves. So why don't you come up to Camp David? Look, it's lovely in March. Well, it's March 22nd. Nixon requests that John Dean put together a report with everything he knew about the Watergate matter. And let's go to Camp David to do so. And Dean says, yeah, whole weekend, all expense paid, weekend with Dick Nixon at Camp David. Hey, sounds great. Yeah, and I got to do some work on the report. And then he realizes, hey, wait a minute. I'm kind of in trouble here. Because I did some of the cover-up. Now, if I do this report, I'm going to out myself. And they're fitting me. I'm going to take the fall. I'm going to take the fall. And he realizes that if he does the report, he's going to take the fall. So he doesn't complete the report. And there is John Dean, who's now 85 years old. On April 6th, Dean hired an attorney and began his cooperation with the Senate Watergate investigators. And he also decides he's going to keep working as Nixon's chief White House counsel and participate in cover-up efforts. But he's not telling Nixon this at that time. Dean continued to provide information to prosecutors who were able to make enormous progress on the cover-up, which up until then they had virtually ignored. They just wanted to know what happened at the actual burglary and how these guys put this plan together. Well, there they are. Haldeman, the chief of staff, and Ehrlichman, an advisor. Dean had asked Nixon, because he knew he was in trouble. He said, hey, listen, Dick, how about giving me some formal immunity? You know, I might have committed crimes while serving for you as the White House counsel. How about it? No can do. No can do. So Nixon refuses to grant this request, and his refusal led to Dean to cooperate with prosecutors very soon afterwards. John Dean makes a decision. If Nixon gave him some immunity, things might have gone the other way. On April 19th, Dean served notice that no, I'm not going to be the scapegoat for the Watergate scandal. and the word was passed along by deans, associates, and friends. I'm going to implicate Ehrlichman and Haldeman in the case. Please call me Dick. So there's a crisis now that Dick Nixon has to face. On April 30th, the White House announces the resignations of the Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, along with the presidential aides, Ehrlichman and Haldeman, and they fired John Dean. Nixon, after accepting the resignations of 3 of his closest aides and firing Dean, said, "It's me, I'm not a crook, but you can blame me for Watergate." Well, he's not John Dean, he's not going to take this sitting down, I solemnly swear. On June 2015 began his testimony before the Senate Watergate Committee. The committee voted to give him use immunity. In his testimony, he implicated administration officials, including Nixon's fundraiser, and the Attorney General, former Attorney General John Mitchell, Nixon, and himself. For me, this was once tools of the trade, a tape recorder. You needed a tape recorder to be a radio reporter. And this is a pretty simple tape recorder. But it's got your on and off button there, and it's got, it's your volume control, all that other stuff. Very simple, not very expensive at all. And this tape recorder was one of the undoings of Richard Nixon. In February 1971, a sound-activated tape system was installed in the Oval Office, including in Richard Nixon's Oval Office desk. Wonder if he had a tape recorder when I sat there with Gene and Arthur doing "I'm Not a Crook" in his office at Foley Square. Anyway, it was there to capture audio transmitted by telephone taps and concealed microphones. The system was expanded to other rooms within the White House and Camp David. The taping system was confirmed by Senate Committee staff member Donald Sanders on July 13th in an interview with the White House aide Alexander Butterfield, who is one of the few who's still around from the Watergate days. And there is Butterfield testifying. 3 days later, it was made public during the televised testimony of Butterfield when he was asked about the possibility of a White House taping system by Senate counsel Fred Thompson, who would later become senator from Tennessee and was also the star of one of those Law and Order shows on NBC. Tape recorder, real simple, real simple. Put your little spool in there filled with tape, run it through, this one takes it, record, simple, 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 back in the day. Although if you tell kids today about tape recorders, they probably wouldn't know what you're talking about. Absolutely wouldn't. On July 26th, the committee subpoenaed several White House tapes after the president had refused to surrender them. The accuracy of Dean's testimony was confirmed by the tapes. Well, you need a special counsel here, and this is the special counsel coming in, Archibald Cox. In May, Harvard law professor and former U.S. Solicitor General Archibald Cox was asked to become the special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate break-in. Cox clashed with the White House over Nixon's refusal to release 10 hours of secret Oval Office recordings, some of which implicated the president in the break-in. Let me say this about that to make this perfectly clear. By the way, Richard Nixon was brilliant. #1 in his class at Duke Law School. He was very smart. He's also extremely paranoid and he's kind of a strange character. Didn't have Secret Service protection either walking through New York City. Didn't want it after his presidency. He was entitled to it. On October 20th becomes known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon fired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, accepted the resignation of the Attorney General Elliot Richardson and the resignation of the Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelhaus. And there is Richardson, and there is obviously, and look at that smile, it's kind of crooked, but in days when they got along, Ruckelhaus. Saturday night, October 20th, Nixon orders Cox's firing. The person with the authority to dismiss Cox was Richardson. No can do. Well, how about Ruckelhaus? No can do. So that left Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, as the highest ranking official in the Justice Department, and Bork said, "You're fired." And that was that, and there is Robert Bork. The reaction to the firing and resignations would force Nixon to appoint another special prosecutor to replace Cox. Congress would become more interested in what happened at the Watergate complex in June of 1972. John Dean, well, he turns evidence. He pleads guilty to obstruction of justice before Watergate trial judge John Sirica on October 19. Well, there goes the outgoing guy, Leon Jaworski. He's to the left, and Archibald Cox, Leon Jaworski, rather, is to the right. Archibald Cox is to the left. On November 5th, Nixon appoints a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. Jaworski would secure a unanimous United States Supreme Court decision that forced Nixon to release secretly recorded tapes from the Oval Office in July 1974. So, what if something happens to Richard Nixon, like he gets thrown out of office? Who's next in line? Well, it would be that guy, Spiro Agnew, former Maryland governor, vice president of the United States. Except he's not clean either. The Republican presidential nominee, Nixon chose Agnew as his running mate in 1968. He was a moderate governor from a border state, Maryland, who supported the supreme civil rights movement and yet made several tough-on-crime speeches. The Agnew problem. Look, Nixon had little faith in Agnew. But then again, Eisenhower had little faith in Nixon when he was the vice president. Nixon actually would be an announcer for the Washington Senators on occasion. My friend Bob Wolf was the Senators announcer, and I said, how did Nixon do Washington Senators baseball games? He said, very simple. He used to come to baseball games in the afternoon. I went up to him one day and said, how would you like to be on WRC radio and do some games with me? He said, oh, yeah, I would. And Bob kept all of the tapes. Bob passed away a couple of years ago. His son Rick just passed away at the age of 71. And he said, all he did was ask him, and he was there. The conservatives in the United States didn't want Nixon. Why didn't they want Nixon? Well, he was doing things like EPA, Equal Opportunity Employment, Environmental Protection Agency. Also, he basically let 18-year-olds, or pushed for 18-year-olds to vote in 1972. He almost got universal health care, but he was stopped by Ted Kennedy. Conservatives didn't like it. He had a progressive agenda, Title IX, women getting equal rights in colleges for education, and conservatives really, really didn't like that. So they're looking for a guy, and they find him in John M. Ashbrook, running for president. He was from Ohio. Nixon's support for liberal and social economic policies absolutely soured his relationship with conservatives. 1972, Ashbrook would become a protest candidate, so Nixon needed Agnew to go out there and be his bulldog. But at the same time this is going on, a guy by the name of George Beale in Maryland starts an investigation of Spiro Agnew. He was the United States attorney for the District of Maryland, opened up an investigation of corruption in Baltimore County involving public officials, architects, engineering firms, and paving contractors. His target, the leadership of Baltimore County. Now, Agnew left Baltimore County as the chief executive, or the county executive, in 1966 when he became the governor of Maryland. And there is Spiro Agnew back in the day. Lester Matz's engineering firm was served with a subpoena for documents. It was revealed that Matz had been kicking back to Agnew 5% of the value of contracts received through his influence, the first county contracts and then state contracts when Agnew was mayor. And there is Lester Matz. In June, Matz's attorney told Beale that his client could show that Agnew not only had been corrupt, but his the payments to him had continued into his vice presidency. The statute of limitations would not prevent Agnew from being prosecuted for these later events when he was, or payments when he was vice president. And there is Spiro Agnew. On August 1st, Beale sent a letter to Agnew's attorney, formally advising him that the vice president was under investigation for tax fraud and corruption. Matz was prepared to testify that he met Agnew at the White House, gave him a $10,000 handshake at the White House. Jerome B. Wolf, the head of Maryland's Road Commission, had extensive documentation that detailed, as Beale put it, every corrupt payment he participated in with then-Governor Spiro Agnew. Well, Carl Albert was he was the House Majority Leader, and Spiro Agnew, even though he was a Democrat, Spiro Agnew said, let me see if I can play ball with Carl Albert and get this thing done. Agnew felt that a sitting vice president could not be indicted. He met with the Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, on September 25th, asking for an investigation. After all, he said, this guy had it, John C. Calhoun. If he was vice president, if he could have it, why not me? Well, it was 1826, and there was a House of Representatives investigation of the Vice President Calhoun, who was alleged to have taken improper payments while a cabinet member. But Albert said, no, it'd be improper for the House to act in a matter that's before the courts. These two guys are screwed. Agnew and Richard Nixon. They're absolutely screwed. Spiro Agnew resigned on October 10th. The U.S. Justice Department had uncovered widespread evidence of his political corruption, including allegations that his practice of accepting bribes had continued into his tenure as the United States Vice President. Agnew had to bargain with prosecutors to avoid jail. And he eventually said, no contest, I'll plead no contest to tax evasion. The judge ordered 3 years of probation, fined at $10,000. Nixon disappeared, Agnew disappeared from public view. He would never talk to Richard Nixon again. Why? Nixon didn't help him. So here it is, it's time to say goodbye. Spiro Agnew says goodbye. Agnew sent the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, a note, I hereby resign the office of Vice President of the United States, effective immediately. Well, he has to fill the post. Lyndon Johnson didn't have to fill the post when Kennedy was killed and he became president, but laws had changed. And Nixon is looking for a guy to become vice president, and he finds the guy in Gerald Ford. Pursuant to the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, Nixon had to fill the vacant office of vice presidency by nominating a candidate who then had to be approved by both houses of Congress. And there is Richard Nixon, and there is Gerald Ford. Nixon's appointment of the Representative Gerald Ford of Michigan was approved by Congress on December 6th when Ford was sworn in. Well, it's like a broken record, right? Another war in the Middle East, another war in the Middle East. There was the 1948 war, there was the 1956 Suez Canal problem, there was the 1967 Six-Day War, and now you have the Yom Kippur War. It's October 6th. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated attack against Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, were taken by surprise. Egyptian troops swept into the Sinai Peninsula while Syria struggled to throw occupying Israeli troops out of the Golan Heights. It was all put together by this guy, Anwar Sadat, who gambled going to war with Israel would bring some peace between Israel and Egypt. Egypt was economically troubled, and they really couldn't continue protecting themselves against Israel. What Sadat wanted was the peaceful recovery of Sinai, but because Israel won in 1967, it was unlikely that Israel was going to give peace terms favorable to Egypt. So Sadat comes up with a plan to attack Israel again, thinking that if somehow he could inflict some damage, he might get back the Sinai. The war presented a crisis of worldwide proportions. Not only it threatened the long-term stability of the Middle East, but dramatically heated the tensions between the United States, Soviet Union, Cold War, even though Sadat threw 20,000 Soviet advisors out in 1972. The war itself. This was the goal of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. We claimed land and prestige lost in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Remove Israel's superior bargaining position dependent on occupation of 1967 conquered lands. Force Israel into negotiations from a position of relative weakness. And there is Golda Meir, the old Milwaukee school teacher. And she is going to take the fight to not only them, but Richard Nixon as well. Israel's goals: maintain lands captured in 1967 to preserve ideal negotiation positions with respect to Arab states, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and other Arab Palestinian groups. Maintain superior combat effectiveness over Arab enemies in the face of being extremely outnumbered by Arab forces. Cannot strike preemptively in order to not appear to be the aggressor, because Nixon might get upset about that. And here's the map. It's on the Sinai. It's up in Golan Heights. That is where the fighting's taking place. When the Fourth Arab-Israeli War began, many of Israel's soldiers were away from their posts, observing Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. The Arab armies advanced with their up-to-date Soviet weaponry. Iraqi forces soon joined the war, and Syria received some support from Jordan. After several days, Israel was fully mobilized. The Israeli Defense Forces began beating back the Arab gains at a heavy cost to soldiers and equipment. Diplomacy would kick in. There is Nixon and the old Milwaukee school teacher, Golda Meir. A U.S. airlift of arms aided Israel's cause, but Nixon he kind of delays this, but he's got a reason. Not that he was anti-Semitic, which people said he was, but I got along with him. And he had Henry Kissinger, and he had Klein, and he had Stein all around him, and others. But he also, when the Government Accounting Office was condemning his economic policies, he directed one of his staffers to go after all the Jews at the GAO and either fire them or not give them raises. Fred Malik was the guy's name who did that. On October 25th, an Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire was secured by the United Nations, and there is Anwar Sadat. Oh, Egypt lost again, but the initial Egyptian successes greatly enhanced Sadat's prestige in the Middle East and gave him an opportunity to seek peace. And there's Sadat with another real loser, the Syrian Hafez al-Assad, who lost in 1967 in the Six-Day War, who was on the wrong side of Black September when the PLO tried to assassinate King Hussein of Jordan twice, and he'd be a big loser here, but the family still runs Syria. For Syria, the Yom Kippur War was a disaster. The unexpected Egyptian-Israeli ceasefire exposed Syria to military defeat, and Israel seized even more territory in the Golan Heights. Now what? What's next? What's next? On October 19th, 12 OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporters, agreed to an oil embargo. Stop selling oil to the United States and its allies over the next 6 months. You might remember, oil prices quadrupled. For OPEC, the last straw came when the United States supported Israel with a $2.2 billion aid package against Egypt in the Yom Kippur War. Gas as a weapon. How many of you remember going in line every other day to get gas, and maybe only limited to about 8 gallons of gas? That's the way it was back in those days. Except if you lived in Rockland County. And I'll tell you how this was done, because I lived on the New Jersey-New York border. Depending when I needed gas, I'd slip in there at about 5 to 12. They're not going to throw me out if it's the wrong day on my license plate. I've been online. So I didn't have any problems, and some other people knew the same trick. Gasoline shortage, 10 gallons of gas, that's it. Because Arab oil producers cut off exports to the U.S., which brought soaring gas prices and long lines to filling stations, the boycott contributed to a major economic downturn in the United States. That's Lower Manhattan by the Holland Tunnel. I'm not sure if it's traffic into the Holland Tunnel or people just trying to get gas at that Gulf station. I like this one. This is my favorite here, right? This guy's determined to get in there. Determined. Hey, bender, no problem. Oh, another movement, another civil rights movement in the United States, the American Indian Movement. That started in 1968 in an effort to stop police harassment of Indians in the Minneapolis area. Activists went to the Pine Ridge Reservation in 1973, where there were numerous problems with the Agawa tribal chief Richard Wilson. And you might remember Marlon Brando says, "No, I'm not taking this Oscar." You might remember the woman by the name of Sacheen Littlefeather speaking on behalf of Marlon Brando at the Oscars. She endured boos, mockery, and lies when she took the stage at the 1973 Academy Awards to reject an Oscar on behalf of the Best Actor winner, Marlon Brando, in Godfather, and called for better treatment of Native Americans. Now this guy who's a bad guy, John Wayne, did a Playboy interview 2 years earlier where he said, well, blacks could take political office when they get smarter, among other things. And so John Wayne was at the 1973 Oscars, and he's smoking a cigar even though he had lung cancer and they took out a lung because of smoking. Camels, he smoked camels. He wanted to do something physically. Marty Pacetta, who directed the Oscars from 1972 to 1998, told the Chicago Tribune, John Wayne wanted to go out there and physically yank her off the stage. It took 6 men to hold him back. This guy was a football player back in the 1920s at University of Southern California. Wayne reportedly said if Brando had something to say, he should have appeared that night and stated his views instead of taking some little unknown girl and dressing her up in an Indian outfit. Wounded Knee also happened that year. February 27th, 71 days after the siege began at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, federal officials and AIM members exchanged gunfire nightly. Hundreds of arrests were made, 2 Native Americans were killed, federal marshal permanently paralyzed by a bullet wound. Wounded Knee shed a light on the problems facing American Indians and showed them that they could actually have a voice. Now in 1973, if you saw this guy walking on the street in Manhattan holding one of those things, would you think he was really talking to somebody else or just talking to himself? Because even today, when I see people walking around with this talking, I'm not exactly sure. They're talking to anybody. They might be talking to themselves. Anyway, this is Martin Cooper, and he's on the street in Manhattan, and he doesn't have to wait for the phone because he's making a phone call. It's April 3rd. He makes the first public call on a handheld cellular phone. He would not be the last one to do that. You see people on the phone all the time now in the street. Nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, the technology behind MRIs, is developed. May 14th, Skylab becomes the first American space station to be launched. Secretariat, when horse racing actually still captivated Americans, it doesn't anymore. Horse racing still survives. And it survives based on casino gambling with one-armed bandits and all these racetracks. Secretariat became the first Triple Crown winner in 25 years, swept the 1973 Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and Belmont Stakes, winning each race in a record time. It's Billie Jean King and my father-in-law. He thought Billie Jean King looked like his daughter. Anyway, my father-in-law used to hang around. We used to go to places like Gallagher's 21 Club, and he'd dress up, and they thought he was part of the show. And he used to get people to take pictures. He wouldn't ask me because I was working. And I was embarrassed by it, but now I got pictures of all these people that I could throw in the talks. The Battle of the Sexes, as Helen Cosell called it. On September 20th, the Battle of the Sexes. More than 30,000 fans filled the Houston Astrodome with celebrities like Salvador Dali mixing with what appeared to be aliens wearing tuxedos. Billie Jean King playing tennis for women. Bobby Riggs showing that men were superior. Anybody get into this 50 years ago and really say, oh, Billie Jean King's got to win? Or were you just realize it was a TV show? Because that's what it was a TV show. But here's the guy, the late Shelley Saltman. Here's the guy who promoted it. Shelley, I know, is listening from beyond. He's probably trying to get in touch with me right now with a burner phone. Anyway, he told me stories about this. This is called the Cleopatra entrance. And Billie Jean King comes in as Cleopatra with 4 Rice University track and field athletes carrying her in. And so she's being carried in on the litter. That was Shelley's idea. And there's Bobby Riggs, Riggs Pigs, Sugar Daddies. He's going to give a Sugar Daddy over there. They get Sugar Daddy to sponsor this, and he was the Sugar Daddy. King entered the playing court on a gold litter carried by 4 shirtless members of Rice University's track team. Said, Shelley, how'd you pick up? We said, we need 4 guys. There were 4 guys who raised their hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, you're us. Riggs came in with a rickshaw. I said, Shelley, where'd you get the rickshaw? He said, from a movie studio. Flocked by his bevy of Bobby's bosom buddies. He said, where'd the bosom buddies come from? Strip clubs in Houston. That's where it came from. They exchanged pregame gifts, a baby pig for the chauvinist Riggs, a giant sugar daddy lollipop for King. And there they are, the 2 of them. Remember, this is Billie Jean King. This is an interview I did with Billie Jean King. Remember, Title IX had just passed. I really didn't want it to be weakened. I thought with Margaret Court losing to Riggs in an exhibition, it would be a good chance for some of the people to start jumping on the bandwagon to weaken Title IX, further a tour to hurt women's sports, the women's movement. Bobby Riggs originally proposed the male-female matchup to Billie Jean King, whom he dubbed the leading women's liver of tennis. King ignored the offer, but when the Australian Margaret Court, who won 89 of her last 92 matches, the leading money winner on the tour, accepted and was defeated by Court, she had to do it. As soon as I found out Margaret had lost, I knew I was definitely going to play Bobby Riggs. I did not have a choice. Gave birth to a television extravaganza. I once asked Billie Jean King, I said, why'd you do it besides the money? She got paid really good money. I said, if you win, you beat a 55-year-old man. If you lose, you lost to a 55-year-old man. Had to do it, had to do it. Howard Cosell was there. He was the guy. I knew Howard. I know his grandsons, friends with his grandsons. Howard Cosell was there. He told, Howard asked Bobby Riggs, why are you going to win? I'll tell you why I'll win. She's a woman and they don't have emotional stability. Billie Jean King, of course, was in a no-win situation. Ultimately, she won in what was little more than a promotional gimmick. And there they were on The Odd Couple. On November 7th, New Jersey became the first state to allow girls to compete in Little League Baseball. Me and Yogi Berra. Me and Yogi. I spoke at his museum quite often. We became friendly. And it's in 1973 that he said, it ain't over till it's over. If you're expecting a major story, you're going to be disappointed, because there is none. The Mets, Yogi's managing them, and they lost to the Oakland A's in the 1973 World Series. It was in 1973 that the most famous Yogiism was uttered in response to a question by Mike Dyer, guy I knew too, of the Long Island Press. Mike asked Yogi if his Mets were done in the playoff chase after a loss. Yogi responded, it ain't over till it's over. It would normally be over at this point, except I got to talk about this, the toilet paper shortage. Harold V. Froelich, a Republican congressman from the heavily farthest 8th District of Wisconsin, began receiving complaints from constituents that pulp paper was getting harder to come by. Froelich noticed some news reports of a tissue shortage in Japan. He investigated and believed the source of the claim was companies who were exporting more pulp paper out of the United States to avoid federal price tolls on domestic sales. He issued a second press release on December 11th, this one focusing more on the potential of a shortage of only paper. And American consumers couldn't live without it. He said, the U.S. may face a serious shortage of toilet paper within a few months. We hope we don't have to ration toilet tissue. Toilet paper shortage is no laughing matter. I see nobody's laughing at that here. I guess it wasn't. Well, here's Johnny. On December 19th, the Tonight Show host, Johnny Carson, made mention of the toilet paper issue story in his monologue. He says that, of all the shortages we have, there's a gasoline shortage. You know what else is disappearing from supermarket shelves? Toilet paper. You can laugh now. There's an acute shortage of toilet paper in the good old United States. We got to quit writing on it. But I want to tell you, it's serious. I saw a commercial where Mrs. Olson comes in with a shopping bag, and the housewife says, forget the coffee, just give me the shopping bag. Well, there were empty shelves. There were empty shelves. Carson's mentioned activated a national paper panic. Millions of people cleaned retail shelves of rolls. A store in Seattle ordered 21 cases, but received only 3, adding to the hysteria. One woman reported asking for toilet paper rather than gifts for her party. Can you please, bring toilet paper? Stores tried setting limits of 2 to 4 rolls per customer. Others raised their price from 39 to 69 cents a roll, not to gouge customers, but to dissuade them from buying too much. Other paper products like towels and cups were also in short supply. There were even rumors that a toilet paper black market had emerged, where hoarders were offering rolls at marked up prices. Well, America's most trusted man, Walter Cronkite, who I dealt with twice, we talked about hockey and tennis, decides to set it straight. The toilet paper frenzy continued into 1974, but eventually consumers realized that Froelich's concerns simply weren't materializing. CBS broadcast journalist Walter Cronkite on the network's evening news urged calm on his newscast and aired footage from the Scott Paper Company that demonstrated toilet paper was coming off the factory line without delay. It ain't over until it's over, but it's over. Thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? Your turn to talk. How many of you remember the toilet paper shortage?
There was one during the pandemic.
Yeah, during the